archaeology is a scientific enterprise.
Yes and no. Not to challenge that. It's a weird mixture of humanities and science.
Yeah.
That melds.
Right.
But the database with which we work in archaeology rarely will find manuscripts.
Right.
I mean, extremely rare, because those tend to rot.
Yeah.
Now in Egypt, they're more prevalent.
I was going to say, especially where you have been working. Right. In the area of Israel where you had been working, papyrus manuscripts were usually not preserved as well.
And of course, then there's the inevitable problem of, even if you do have something more substantive, such as wood, it'll rot over time.
Right.
Or people will come plunder the wood to use it as firewood, or building stones. The stones building would be torn down, and those stones used somewhere else in another construction. And so we inevitably have a very, very skewed database. So we have to be very careful about the kinds of inferences we draw from the fragmentary remains that are there. I would argue rarely, I'm not going to say never, because I try to avoid making those kind of absolute remarks.
Sure.
But very rarely will you ever have a situation where archaeology has intrinsically proved something. The flip side also is true. Archaeology rarely, if ever, disproves anything.
Hey everyone, welcome to Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today I had the great honor of interviewing Dr. Dale Manor, Professor Emeritus of Bible and Archaeology of Harding University. I first met Dr. Manor when I was a freshman and took him for an Old Testament survey class in the spring of 2005. Even though the Old Testament isn't where my own studies would eventually focus, or even my favorite testament, if I'm being honest, Dr. Manor still ranks as one of my all-time favorite teachers. And just ask my folks, I was in school for a very long time. In addition to Dr. Manor's work as a professor, he has also served as the field director for excavations at Tel Beth-Shemesh, and has partnered with a couple of professors from Tel-Aviv University on that project, Zvi Lederman and the late Shlomo Bunimovitz. Given Dr. Manor's expertise in both the Old Testament text and the archaeology of Old Testament sites, I wanted to ask him what archaeology can tell us about the Bible, and what is one thing he would want every Christian to know about the Old Testament. Our conversation was so enthralling that we ended up having enough material for 2 episodes. So, what you're about to listen to is part 1 of 2. If you enjoy the kinds of conversations we're having here on the podcast, would you be willing to like and subscribe to us, and maybe share us with someone you think that might benefit from this? And as always, thank you so much for tuning in today. Well, Dr. Manor, I am so excited to be able to have this conversation with you. I really appreciate you being able to sit down and talk with me and the rest of the folks about some neat things about the Bible, and maybe how we can understand the Bible, maybe appreciate especially the Old Testament a little bit better. But before we get into all of that, I would like to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Maybe how long did you teach? What sort of piqued your interest in archaeology, since that's one of the things that you are most known for? Help us get to know you a little bit before we dig into the rest of our conversation this morning.
Well, I think critically important is the contribution that my parents made to all of this. My dad was a preacher, and I grew up as a preacher's kid. And we moved around a good bit. I was born in Tennessee, and eventually we moved to California. And that preacher life was indelibly imprinted in my psyche.
Yeah.
And Dad tells me, Mom and Dad both tell me that from preschool time, I wanted to grow up to be a preacher.
Oh.
And within certain parameters, I've continued that essentially all my life. And but there was this strange intrusion that began to encroach into the character. I guess probably like most kids, at some point I want to be a fireman or, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
I really don't remember that. I don't even know if I did. But
we can reasonably infer that.
yeah. I mean, most kids go through similar patterns in that regard. But preaching was something that I always came back to. Mm-hmm. And when I was 6, we've typically always had some cats at the house. Mm-hmm. Mom had cats and so forth. And we had one in Hartsville, Tennessee, when Dad was preaching there. And for some reason, it died. I did not kill it. Okay, I want to emphasize that real quickly. But the cat died, and we buried it and out in the backyard. And about a year later, I dug it up to sort of see what had happened.
Just out of curiosity.
And I think
maybe that's
sort of
what killed the cat. Sorry.
Curiosity.
Sorry.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Hopefully it didn't kill me yet. Anyway.
Yeah, right. It hadn't gotten yet. Yeah.
But I think I dug it up prematurely. A little bit. But it was just that curiosity. And I always had an interest in digging things up. Mm-hmm. I played in the dirt. I had a little, my dump trucks and all that kind of stuff, and would dig tunnels and build roads and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And when we go to state parks, Civil War parks and all that kind of stuff, I was just fascinated with the history and archaeology. And formally, I didn't think in terms of archaeology. Mm-hmm. But when I was in junior high school, by this time we were in California, San Diego, my folks gave me one year, I guess it was a birthday present or something, and a book entitled The Complete Book of Marvels, Marvels. Nothing to do with a comic character.
Yeah.
And it was written by a guy named Richard Halliburton. I think he may be part of the old Halliburton family that we hear about, construction and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure about that.
I think that's the group that's one group that's big down here and with the refineries. And
I think he's connected with them, but I'm not. Gotcha. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was a rich kid. Okay.
Yeah.
Very rich kid, and for whatever reason, decided to travel around the world and go to all these historical archaeological places. And among them were Machu Picchu, Teotihuacan, Mexico, mm-hmm. going through the Panama Canal. He swam through the Panama Canal. And interestingly, the cost for passage is the displacement of the water that you, as a vessel, displace. And so his fee was minuscule. And
if you eat a light lunch the day before, you save a few pennies.
Save a few bucks. But of course, among the sites that he visited was Rhodes and Athens and the pyramids and all these biblical sites, or some of those biblical sites. And I just devoured this book.
Yeah.
It was so fascinating to me. And I continued to want to be a preacher, and I eventually did get a bachelor's degree in Bible. I went to Freed-Hardeman and Pepperdine, and I don't know how that's going to react in your audience.
I think we pull from both crowds, yeah.
But as a footnote here, I want to say I got a very good education at both institutions.
Yeah.
Okay, I value them very highly. But my AA degree in Bible was from Freed-Hardeman, and then I went to finished up bachelor's at Pepperdine, and continued then living in California. And it was a degree in Bible, and I was preaching. I was already preaching. And as a graduation gift, Mother and Dad at that point were conducting tours to the Middle East. And so as a graduation gift, I was given a tour with them to the Bible lands. And this sort of tipped the scale. Okay.
Right. You were done already, after that point.
I had already noticed, well, I hadn't noticed at this point, but when there was a paper, if there was an assignment in class that was wide open to write on, other than a specific kind of assignment, if it was an analysis of why was the whale white in Moby Dick, okay, I wrote on that. I actually did write a paper on that. But anyway, but if it was a wide open assignment as a writing exercise, I gravitated toward biblical historical stuff and really enjoyed that. And then I was, because of this trip and because of this tendency toward historical studies and archaeological stuff, and I wasn't really fully conscious of the archaeology element of it at this point. I'm a slow learner, sometimes really slow in the uptake. But I would integrate that into my biblical studies and in my preaching and in my teaching. And I preached locally for 25 years before coming to Harding.
Yeah.
So I have a long history in local full-time ministry. As sort of a footnote, and this is nothing pejorative about our colleagues here.
Yeah.
I probably have as much, if not more, full-time ministry experience than most of the ministry guys here at Harding. Now, do not infer from that that I know more about all of that, because they've done a lot of study on that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But from the standpoint of boots on the ground and the local congregation, that's a rich background.
Very much
well,
so.
The more I kept going into this, the more biblical world and so forth. And I began conducting some tours to Israel. And I decided, I'd like to get a degree in archaeology to use that meaningfully in the church.
Yeah.
And so I decided to quit at that point, that congregation in San Diego, and move to Tucson and enter the University of Arizona, which had a world premiere archaeology program under William G. Deaver. And so I entered that program and majored in Syro-Palestinian archaeology. They tended not to call it biblical archaeology.
Weird, right?
But it was Syro-Palestinian. And one of the requirements, of course, was that you go on excavations.
Okay.
And I mean, that makes perfectly good sense.
Right.
I mean, it's sort of like, do you want to go to a physician that's never studied anatomy, cutting cadavers and all that kind of stuff? You don't want to do that.
Digging around, the metaphor works. Yeah.
Yeah. Probing, digging.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that I again, by that point, had a full-time ministry job as well in conjunction with the classwork. And eventually then I thought, well, it'd be really cool to teach in a university setting.
Yeah.
Now that's easier said than done.
Even back then.
Even back then.
Yeah.
Howard Norton, now a good friend of mine, but I knew him a little bit back then. I was talking to him about getting a job teaching. And he said, well, it's sort of like standing beside a railroad track, and there's a passenger train going by, and all of the windows are closed except one. And you're trying to throw a rock and get it through that open window. That's sort of the chance situation. I know this is real comforting to you. That's sort of the chance situation of getting a job teaching, at least in one of our Christian universities.
Sure, yeah.
Well, compounding that was the fact that I did not have an MDiv. You at least have the privilege of that I did not have. And so I went straight from a bachelor's degree to a master's in archaeology, a PhD in archaeology, with a minor, by the way, in Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
But the time came when I received a phone call from Harding inviting me to come and interview. And I was just bewildered at this because I'd been told, if we only had an MDiv, then, we could hire you, but because you don't, we don't know what to do with you. Your degree is too specialized, even though it is in biblical archaeology and you've studied all of this biblical history and studied languages and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
Well, Harding at least recognized, he has 25 years of full-time ministry experience. And we are trying to train ministers. And he has this degree that is biblical archaeology. It's not like Mayan archaeology.
Right.
Now that's not to knock Mayan archaeology,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
that's, unrelated to the Bible.
Mhm.
And so they decided to hire me. And so I taught at Harding for 24 years.
Yeah.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. Admittedly, we did not have an archaeology program per se, but I taught Bible majors. Almost every year I taught the Bible majors class in Old Testament survey,
Mhm.
and then seminars, and occasionally Hebrew language classes. Not often, because there are other guys here that know Hebrew much better than I.
Mm.
But I could do that, especially if we got in a pinch. And so in my classes, particularly those historical classes, but even in some of the poetic classes and prophetics, particularly, a lot of archaeology can come in very profitably in helping to elucidate what's going on. I do want to emphasize, I did not get into archaeology to prove the Bible.
Right.
That was not my agenda.
Mhm.
A lot of people think, archaeology proves the Bible. Yes and no.
Depends on how we use this word prove.
It does.
Yeah.
And it also has to recognize that the theories of archaeology change from time to time.
Sure. Yeah.
The database changes.
Right.
And so I approach the Bible from the standpoint, I don't go to a place in order to prove an event.
Mhm.
But I admittedly will have to say that I go to excavate in Israel, and that's the only place I've excavated, by the way.
Right.
I go to excavate in Israel in order to broaden my horizon of what was going on in the biblical world.
Yeah.
Now, I sort of compare it to if you think in terms of a database. Okay, using archaeology as an example.
Yeah, because archaeology is a scientific enterprise.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Not to challenge that. It's a weird mixture of humanities and science.
Yeah. Yeah.
That melds.
Right.
But the database with which we work in archaeology rarely will find manuscripts.
Right.
I mean, extremely rare, because those tend to rot.
Yeah.
Now in Egypt, they're more prevalent.
I was going to say,
especially
especially where you have been working,
right,
in the area of Israel where you had been working, papyrus manuscripts were usually not preserved as well.
Matter of fact, I don't know of anybody other than down around the Dead Sea,
right,
in the Jordan Valley, where papyrus have been found.
Yeah.
At least from that far back.
Yeah.
Now there may be, but I'm not aware of.
Sure. But like you said, Egypt, the climate is more amenable to preserving those types of manuscripts.
And of course, you're well familiar with Oxyrhynchus finds and papyri and so forth.
Yeah. For the sake of our listeners, a city in Egypt that the climate worked out to where there's or archaeologists have found what are equivalent of like ancient trash heaps.
Right.
And it just found all kinds of mundane things like receipts and laundry lists and business contracts, and also some other things of greater significance as well. But in this town known as Oxyrhynchus, the climate was conducive for preserving a lot of that kind of stuff.
And of course, then there's the inevitable problem of, even if you do have something more substantive, such as wood, it'll rot over time.
Right.
Or people will come plunder the wood to use it as firewood. Or building stones. The stones would, building would be torn down, and those stones used somewhere else in another construction. And so we inevitably have a very, very skewed database. So we have to be very careful about the kinds of inferences we draw from the fragmentary remains that are there. I would argue rarely, I'm not going to say never, because I try to avoid making those kind of absolute remarks.
Sure.
But very rarely will you ever have a situation where archaeology has intrinsically proved something. The flip side also is true. Archaeology rarely, if ever, disproves anything. So it's more of the more data and the more corroborating kinds of data that you have coming together, the richer the context
Yeah.
and the background and the texture of what's going on, say in the biblical text.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of approach that I have to archaeology. I want to enrich our understanding of what is there. And in my experience, one of the things that archaeology did, and I did not anticipate this. This is something that just sort of surprised me.
Sure. Yeah.
It was naive on my part not to think this earlier this way. But once I got into it, one of the things that really surprised me is, most people in the ancient world were concerned about the same kind of things we are. Now, they may have gone about dealing with them differently.
Sure. Yeah.
But even then, a lot of times it's not a whole lot different. Sometimes it's more of a technological variation than it is a pursuit kind of thing.
Yeah. And one thing I've heard you say several times before is that people in the ancient world were often far more sophisticated than we give them credit for.
I mean, think of our trying to figure out how they built the pyramid. And I do not believe it's space aliens.
You mean the History Channel's been lying to me this whole time?
Depends on which program you're watching. By the way, recently there was a discovery made over by the Red Sea.
Okay.
That has some manuscripts in which, I forget the title of this. I could look it up and send it to you later. But
that'd be great to put in the link, put as a link in the description of this episode.
But there were manuscripts found that described the production and delivery of the stones that were used in the construction of the pyramids.
Ooh, that's cool.
Yeah. I mean,
that's cool.
I mean, this is like in your face, you alien types.
Right. So I'm getting the sense that these manuscripts don't describe flying cups.
No.
Hovering.
They may be asking for a cup of water, but beyond that, no.
Yeah, gotcha.
But anyway, that's sort of where I am. And I taught at Harding for 24 years. I retired a year ago. I'm still around. I'm still writing.
For those watching, you're in your office there in Searcy.
They let me keep my office at the school. And I'm also, excuse me, also working on the excavation report. I'm associated with a project at Tel Beth-Shemesh in Israel. I'm one of the three main personnel there. Regretfully, one of them passed away. Yeah, I don't know if you knew that. Shlomo Bunimovitz
when I interviewed you for a Sunday night thing several months ago, you had mentioned that it was Shlomo. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's sort of Zvi and I who are left, but so we have to take up the slack and work on the report of the excavation, and so that's a major project.
Yeah,
and so I will be ongoing there, and of course Harding gets some credit, feather in the cap. One of our guys is working on this scholarly production that Harding has been a part of. So that's sort of a nutshell where I am, who I am, why I am, kind of thing.
That's sort of a philosophical take on it. Since you have mentioned Tel Beth-Shemesh, would you mind if we maybe used Beth-Shemesh as kind of a test case, or maybe a case in point, to demonstrate something that you had mentioned earlier about archaeology not necessarily proving or disproving? You have found something interesting about pig bones at Beth-Shemesh.
Right.
Would you be willing, since I've heard you talk about this before several times, would you be willing to kind of give us sort of the 10 peso version, right, of what it is about pig bones that was significant when you found them and didn't find them?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Now, as we excavate the sites, particularly in Palestine, or Canaan, Israel, I'm not using those terms politically.
There's no modern political associations with using that terms. Those are technical, historic terms. Yeah.
Right. And I hope I didn't offend anybody by that. But anyway, there are a limited number of places where people before modernization, before aqueducts in particular, come into existence. And so there's a limited number of places where people could live.
Right.
Criteria that are vitally important is water source. Secondly is arable land. Thirdly is defensibility. Obviously, water is primary.
Yeah.
The other two, which is more important, is open to negotiation. And then the fourth would be transportation access. And so there are a limited number of places where all of these features converge. And so I sort of stereotype this. Okay, here's a place where someone comes along and says, we got a water source, it's defensible, there's arable land, let's build a house, build a town. And so they build the towns, typically in Canaan, ancient Canaan, out of mud brick, unfired, of course, just mud brick. And after a while, there's a plague, there's a war, there's a famine, there's whatever, and the town is abandoned.
Sure. Yeah.
And with the town abandoned, then the winds blow and the rains come. Sounds like Jesus. And the floods come, and these mud brick houses dissolve into a layer of mush.
Yeah, because it is mud.
It is mud. And then somebody else comes along later and says, here's a water source, here's a defensible area, here's arable land, let's build another town. And so they build on top of it. Another plague, another famine, another war. This is abandoned. The layer then becomes mush. And then another group comes along, here's water, and you have this building up.
Right.
Now, the archaeologist, and this is important to understand why what I'm about to describe. The archaeologist removes these in reverse order of their deposition.
Yeah.
So at Beth-Shemesh, I'm going to talk about the Tel because things weird have happened off the Tel.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
That's another, it's a fascinating story.
Tel there is Hebrew or Arabic word.
Either way.
That means basically hill or mound, right?
It's more than a hill or mound. It is a ruin.
Okay. So specifically ruin.
Yeah. More of a ruin kind of
Gotcha.
thing.
So like people are familiar with Tel-Aviv.
Right. Although in that case, it's a misnomer.
Oh, okay. Well, I'd always kind of wondered.
There was no Tel there. Why they named it that, I don't know. But
yeah.
But anyway, so as we remove this, at Beth-Shemesh, the latest on the Tel occupation is essentially the period that was destroyed by Sennacherib in 701.
Okay. 701 BC, right? So the Assyrians
701 BC.
Yeah.
And so as we remove this section, all of the bones that we have here, there are no pig bones. Well, this is the time the Israelites are living there.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising, no pig bones. And so as we remove that, the next layer down dates to an earlier period, Ahaziah. And all of the material that we find here, there are no pig bones.
Right.
And so we remove this.
And still during times in which the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, presents Israelite occupation of this particular site. Yeah, that's important to keep in mind. Yeah.
And so all of these layers, till I tell you differently, are layers that were basically occupied by the Israelites.
Yeah.
So the next layer down would be roughly the time period of Rehoboam.
Okay.
And no pig bones. So all this has been removed. And then we come to the period just before Rehoboam, no pig bones. And so as we come to this transition that we refer to in archaeology and historical studies as the transition from the Iron Age, which is later, to the late Bronze Age, which would be earlier, we're curious. Okay, now this opens another discussion, which I don't want to get into unless you insist on doing so. And it's the issue of the date of the Exodus.
Sure, yeah. Another conversation for another time.
Another conversation for another time.
Yeah.
But there are two premises that are typically proffered for the date of the Exodus. One is the early date in the 1400s.
Right.
And a lot of conservative Christians subscribe to that. And I'm okay with that. Okay. The other date is known as the late date, and it is in the 1200s. Many, but not the majority of conservative Christians subscribe to this.
Yeah. Just for the sake of reference, what else in world history is going on around, say, the 1200s? Is that Trojan War era? Like, is that?
It would be roughly. It also is the time that the Hittites and the Egyptians are fighting each other with Ramesses II.
Okay. Yeah.
And you have your first, by the way, clarification here, you'll often hear this is the first treaty that we have, political treaty. It's true. That's not true. It is the first record of a treaty from both sides.
Oh, okay.
That we have preserved.
So we can compare and contrast notes, right?
Right. And so the Hittites have one version of the treaty and the Egyptians have another version of the treaty, but it's the same treaty. And the Egyptians make themselves look, we scared the pants off the Hittites, so they wanted to sue for peace. The Hittites, basically said, this wasn't going anywhere, so we decided to quit fighting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Hittite one seems to be a little more accurate.
Fair enough.
But again, we weren't there. Okay.
It's at least less self-aggrandizing, right?
Exactly.
Fair enough.
So anyway, so as we come to this period that is the beginning of the Iron Age,
so
which
roughly kind of 1200 BC, yeah,
1200-ish, 1150-ish BC. This is when even the Egyptian records indicate that there are people known as Israelites living in the land.
Interesting.
Because in 1207 BC, Merneptah, who is one of the Egyptian kings, talks in terms about going into the land of Canaan, and he boasts that he's eliminated and wiped out the Israelites, which is sort of typical Egyptian hyperbole.
Yeah.
He had not wiped out the Israelites because they're still there.
Right.
But he apparently has defeated at least some of them.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Now, the Bible doesn't give us any record of this, and I'm not saying that Merneptah is wrong, nor am I implying that the Bible is wrong. It's just something that was neither, the Bible doesn't talk about.
The biblical records, like any historical records, are necessarily selective.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's simply how history works. Historiography specifically.
Right, and it has to. Anyway, but as we come to the beginning of the Iron Age, we've had no pig bones.
Right.
So all these layers that have been up here are Israelite occupied. No pig bones. No pig bone, no pig bone, no pig bone, no pig bone, no pig bone. And as we sit here on the threshold of breaking into the late Bronze Age, now, admittedly, Zvi Lederman, Shlomo Bunimovitz, and I are all of the persuasion that this is about the time that the Israelites begin to emerge.
Sure.
Now, the explanation for that, of how that happens, we don't agree on, but nonetheless, time-wise, we agree. So I'm a late Exodus guy.
Yeah. Okay.
And
so around 1200-ish.
1200-ish.
Yeah.
And so we were anxiously wondering what's going to happen. Are there going to be pig bones or not? And so now the area that we've actually exposed, the area that we've exposed on Iron Age is relatively huge because you're sort of tapering down.
Yeah.
And as you go further and further into this, the smaller your sample is.
Understood.
So all of this, no pig bones, no pig bone, no pig bone. And now we have a fairly small little area of late Bronze Age stuff. And we start finding pig bone.
Ooh.
Now, then the big question is, why did the Canaanites have pig bones and the Israelites who live in the same area not?
Yeah.
Now, to probably you and I as believers, the Bible says something about this.
Very, very much so.
You're not supposed to eat pig.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a big deal in the book of Leviticus, and hinted at in a few other places. Isaiah alludes to contemptuously his attitude toward, or God's attitude toward, what you do is like offering pig's flesh on the altar.
Yeah.
But the Canaanites and the Philistines, who were their neighbors, and particularly the Philistines, ate truckloads of pigs, relatively speaking. So why is this difference? Is it because the Israelites had this understanding that we as an ethnicity are defined in part by what we eat? That's what I would understand.
Sure. Yeah.
And Shlomo argue it is based on another issue.
Yeah.
But anyway,
those two gentlemen that you work with from Tel-Aviv University, they're not believers.
No,
in any sense.
They're respectful of the Bible. I do
Yeah.
want to emphasize that.
Yeah.
But they're not believers. They're good people.
Right. Right.
They don't discard the Bible. Matter of fact, I've been surprised sometimes when Zvi and Shlomo have used the Bible to explain something.
Mm-hmm.
I've been very encouraged by that.
Yeah.
So because some of the scholars just brush the Bible off as totally irrelevant,
which is frustrating when scholars do that, because if you're looking for any historical source that gets us at least closer to the time of the events,
right?
Well, Hebrew Bible is what we have, and if you can corroborate with material culture or things like that, as what y'all have done, so help us kind of narrow down in on the issue here. Does the absence of pig bones and then the sudden presence of pig bones, does that prove the Bible, or kind of walk us through that?
No, it does not prove the Bible. It would be sort of a cog in a gear.
Mm-hmm.
It would be an aspect that, if the Bible is accurate, this would not be surprising.
Right. Yeah.
But if the Bible's irrelevant, it's just interesting.
An interesting coincidence.
Right.
Yeah.
So I look at it as a corroborative element, but it's not proof.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a difference.
I was going to ask if corroborating evidence is a fair way to describe.
It dovetails.
Okay.
It meshes with what we would expect to be the case, but it does not necessarily prove. It's sort of like somebody writing a historical fiction. It happens to be the same, but does it prove that it happened? I mean, historical fiction, sort of by definition, is a framework of someone writes something as if it's real, but it's not necessarily real.
Sure. Yeah. And historical fiction is a known genre of literature.
Right.
Right. I don't read a historical fiction the same way I would read, say, a biography or a historical account. You mentioned Civil War battlefields earlier. I wouldn't read a biography of a Civil War figure the same way that I would read maybe a historical fiction. I would expect some semblance of reality. Right.
Now, some of your listeners and viewers may be familiar with James Michener.
Okay. How do you spell that last name?
Michener.
Okay.
And he's written, of course, I don't know how old your audience tends to be, but it
ranges from my parents to people younger than me. So
he's older than I. Okay. I assume he's probably passed away by now.
Mm-hmm.
But he wrote a lot of books, wrote one on Texas, a story of Texas.
Okay.
And he's written one on space flight of some kind. I'm not familiar with the title of it, but he wrote one called The Source. Just that's it, The Source.
Okay.
And it's a historical fiction where he has taken events, particularly in the land of Palestine, in Canaan, and he's constructed a story around events. So the events and circumstances serve as cogs in his story, but he's invented situations in addition that mesh and meld with it. So you have to read this with reservation. But it's another book that contributed significantly to me going into archaeology.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because it's set in Palestine. It goes from very, very early prehistoric, which I'm not sure what to deal with. Okay, don't ask me.
Right. Another conversation for another time.
But it sort of picks up, to me, meaningfully around the time of Abraham. And there's this fictional site that he focuses on called Makor, which means source, and hence the title of the book.
Yeah.
And this site called the Source doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
But he has taken things from different archaeological sites and put them in his fictional story at the Source.
Yeah.
And these then sort of serve as touch points from which then he develops a story.
Yeah.
And it's about a third of the book I was like slogging through a mud pit. And I don't mean that in a pun way.
Yeah. Yeah.
But once it got through, for me, once I got through about that, this picked up significantly in interest. It goes all the way from prehistoric times up until, I think, 1948 AD.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. A significant year for that part of the world.
Right.
Yeah. And so when we kind of look at something like, we have biblical text describing a group of people, the Israelites, and there's consistent mention of how they're supposed to abstain from eating pigs. And we see what we've got, we see what we can find in the ground or not find in the ground, as the case may be, where no pig bones. And then suddenly the layers that we might start expecting to find pig bones, we start finding pig bones, because that's when the Israelites would not have been occupying this particular site. We can kind of look at that as corroborating evidence that says, well, this doesn't necessarily prove, right, the Bible, but
right.
It does lend, what would you describe? Veracity? There's a technical term in biblical studies called verisimilitude. It certainly looks as if these two things are presenting reality. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And then the interpretation of it then becomes colored. I don't mean that in a negative way.
Right.
But it depends on the lens from which one is looking at the datum.
Mm-hmm.
A believer will look at it one way, a non-believer will look at it another way.
Yeah.
So the datum itself is what it is.
Sure. Yeah.
How do you understand it then becomes the big question.
Yeah. Yeah.